Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming, and welcome to our Brandt Forum on Agriculture and Environmental Policy, Opportunities and Challenges. Brought to you by CIFER, the Council on Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economic. My name is Hochman, and I'm a CIFER Board Chair and Professor at Rutgers University, and it is my pleasure to be moderating this event. It's CIFER's mission to transition high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agriculture and applied economics. Before we start, we just wanted to point out we welcome any interaction with you. Feel free to email us with any concern, queries, or comments at information@cifer.org. And you can find us on all existing social media. Just search our name, the Council on Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics. Before we start, I want to offer a whole multitude of gratitude to NIFA for helping us fund this event and sponsor it, as well as for our partners. This and other CIFER events and programs would not be possible without the continuing support of the Agriculture and Applied Economic Association, AAEA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Agricultural and Statistics, NASS, and the USDA Economic Research Services, ERS. We're ready to start. This workshop includes two main strands of engagement across governments, private, public sector participants. The first strand will focus on the implication of policy on the U.S. economy's competitiveness, resilience, and sustainability. The second one will discuss the dynamics of policy and how it can support innovative and development of resilient supply chains. The workshop discusses the dynamics of policy, ensuring efficiency, access, diversity, and inclusion. The presentation by scholarly people internationally known in this field will help us better understand this topic, which I think is of utmost importance. What did we learn so far? CIFER had two previous events on the topic. The first one was a Brandt Forum in 2022 on agricultural and environmental science-based policy. It included 4 components. One was looking at policy design and environmental policy, and then focusing on 3 topics, more specifically trying to understand them: the bioeconomy, water markets, and energy market. The third one, which was this January at the ASSA meeting, further dwelled into the importance of policy, its design, regulatory choices, as well as more refined understanding of agro-environmental programs, and again dwelling into some of the topics, including trade, biofuels, and more generally, how that falls in the context of supply chains. Most topics we'll revisit today more thoroughly and try to understand them better. When we started talking about policy design, political economy and political power is an important component, and it affects the distribution of benefits, which are, and cost, sometimes a major component, a very key component in the design of policy beyond efficiency. Politicians and government officials many times are involved in policy design and facing sometimes even severe conflicts between their private interest and the public good. And these interests many times are driven by lobbies and voters. Involvement of stakeholders affects how evidence is incorporated into policymaking, and frequently, and this is a topic that we'll return to shortly, we see policymakers using upper bound on pollution intensity, even though we know as economists efficiency and market incentives, taxes is superior as an efficiency tool, but we do see like chemical concentration upper bounds with the essential elements of waste management. We see water and air control regulations and speed limit, among many others. Another important component that we looked at when the premise to building or understanding better the design of policy before we dwell into specific areas is heterogeneity and short run. Politician needs to be elected. If they're not elected, they're not making a change. So short run is important to them. Profitability is important to them. Prices, economic welfare, impact on employment, as we're seeing, is key to the way they drive and design policy. Another important component that through work we began to understand, learning from others in the literature, heterogeneity is vast. Even within very narrowly defined industries, you see a lot of heterogeneity. Just look at the differences in energy intensity within the electricity sector. You see a whole spectrum of potential emissions per unit produced. So heterogeneity is key, and that is as well as the short run. Building on that, trying to understand how we design the policy, when we introduce this political uncertainty in democracies, which is inherent to democracies, politicians will never know with certainty that he'll get elected next time. And then there is the component that the politician, he or she would like to maintain a legacy, something that is left after they leave. That, coupled with irreversibility, will result in desire of incumbent government to establish outcomes on the ground, to basically tie the hands of future governments. When we have the party in power that values the environment as an example, it may levy a more stringent taxes or more stringent policy than otherwise. That more stringent policy will trigger more adoption, more change as long as it's in power. That change will then develop larger coalitions that will support it in the future or prevent its reversal. And this is something that has also been documented in the political science literature. So the forward-looking politicians incorporate the probability of losing power into their policy design. This is where we started. And given this irreversible investment, the incumbent government may usher in current period policy to trigger more adoption, early adoption, which is interesting because this is in contrast to uncertainty in investment that causes firms to postpone investment in new products. This uncertainty, this political uncertainty, triggers actually early adoption, or the desire of politicians to trigger early adoption, given this uncertainty that is inherent in democratic regimes. Building on this framework in previous work, we tried to understand how that might affect regulatory choices. Just as two examples, look at Germany and look at California. If we look at Germany, in 2000, Germany implemented a Renewable Energy Act, which offered long-term, risk-free contracts to those investing. The policy spurred a substantial deployment of solar photovoltaic models and helped bring costs down of solar and its wide diffusion. That, in turn, led to a bigger coalition within Germany supporting the renewables and to more ambitious renewable energy targets, as documented in the literature. Another example is the California climate policy path. It began with AB 1493, when in 2002, California introduced tradable fleet emissions technology standards targeting emissions from new motor vehicles. Following that, California initiated an electricity sector renewable portfolio standard, SB 1078. As documented in Heinemann 2008, finally, sectoral policy led to an economy-wide emission cap. So again, you see this ratcheting up effect, which is a very important component, and you can explain it. I'm not saying it's the only explanation, and it might not be the right one, but hypothetically or plausibly explanation is this political uncertainty and the way politicians respond to a policy design. And that results in their attempt to develop early adoption. So it's not spending a lot of money, it's trying to trigger a big change in the industry. Those coalitions are important as they move forward. So while focusing on an intensity upper bound versus an ad valorem tax, we know from previous literature that an intensity upper bound has a smaller impact on employment. That means that introducing a policy that achieves the same environmental goals, an intensity upper bound result in less economic hardship. However, this political process of the way politicians respond, and we show it results in a tax over time becoming the preferred policy, helping us understand how this ratcheting up, how this movement in regulation and in adoption, more importantly, much more importantly, how this diffusing of the new technologies triggered this change in policies, and this is documented extensively in the literature. Following those presentations, we had Dr. Dallas Botroff from RFF present us on the electricity sector. In principle, emission pricing should align marginal social costs with prices. We will all agree with that. However, in the power sector, marginal costs already differ substantially from the electricity prices. And again, these are statements made by Dallas Botroff. Marginal costs have very substantial differences across time of day, and most consumers do not see real time. So there is, using the marginal price can become very, very challenging. But what is interesting, in spite of not using market-based and more regulatory instruments, we do see a significant reduction in emissions in the electricity sector. Again, this is taken from Bertrand, and this specific data is taken from EPA. They did the analysis, but what is very interesting is that it came at a lower cost. It didn't come at a higher cost. It came at a lower cost. Cost of average kilowatts an hour went down from 0.184 kilowatt an hour to 0.159 according to EPA data, and you see a very significant decline in sulfur and NOx, not as high in carbon, but still a 22% decline. This is data presented by EPA. Following Dr. Bertrand, Dr. Jinji Wu presented, helped us better understand the importance of eco-environmental policy and how they design can affect policy. He pointed out in his talk that there is strong non-linearities and ecosystem linkages that militant against the political palpable funding criteria. And what is even more important to understand as we move forward, as we design policies, formulas or guidelines based on political consideration may bear a substantial benefit losses. He focused his work on environmental programs and assess their value, and if anyone is interested in this paper, I'll be happy to share them. Following that talk, Dr. Andrew Muhammad talked about trade while focusing on the steel trade tariffs, specifically Section 232 of the tariff and quotas imposed on imported steel in the U.S. And his work shows that we should not look at consumers versus producers. It is a much more complex story. The supply chain is much, much richer. And in this specific case, the imposing of the tariffs on steels that protects the steel producers in the U.S. hurt even significantly the can producers in his example. They used steel to produce cans, and that resulted in that industry suffering from the same tariffs that have been imposed to protect the different industry in the U.S. The main take-home from, not the main, one of the take-home from his presentation is that it's about special interest, and it's about specific groups. It's not about producers and consumers, and when we look at policy under that lens, we can better understand it while breaking down the supply chain, which is a topic that we visited in the past, as well as look again today more thoroughly. Following that, we missed her today. She's apologizing, but something happened and she can't come today. I'm sorry for that. But Catherine Kling talked about water markets, and her main takeaway, an important one, she is a firm believer in the use of tax or the advocating for the tax use of market-based incentive because of efficiency. However, when you look at the Clean Water Act, even though it's not based on market incentives, there are regulatory parts in it, it did reach the targets. It's focusing on the industry. However, the Clean Water Act exempts agriculture, and this results in a cost. And based on her work, she argued that voluntary agreements do not work in this context. So we can't expect voluntary the industry or the producers or the farmers to respond and simply reach an efficient outcome or reach our target goals in terms of emissions. Voluntary won't work. And the point is even made even starker. States can regulate beyond the federal government, few do. And again, that goes back to the political economy and the way policy is being stated. But even though the federal government exempts the agricultural sector, states can still impose a policy. There's an example in Florida where it really works. The state does intervene, but that is a very unique example. And again, her presentation is available on our website. I'm happy to share with you or share the work that supports it. So based on these initial or preliminary understanding, we wanted to take it one step further and understand how do you create policy then? We have big objectives. We have huge challenges facing us in terms of climate or in terms of food. These are very big challenges. And the question is, how do you develop policy? And that's the main reason, that's the reason we brought all these world-renowned scholars to talk about these topics. How do you develop push policies? Policies that are directly funded by government for R&D. Again, some of the insights showed here that we do want to promote early adoption. It's important because that changes the political environment and help us moving forward, especially in democratic regime, and the Western world is democratic. How do you develop pull policies that will create a demand and create a demand for the supply chain and the product being invented and pull it up and make this profitable for the firms to prosper there? Firms will look for profits. If there's no profits, the firm will not be there. The stakeholders will not let it stay there. And finally, how do you create empowered policies? The various speakers will touch about many of these topics. So at the baseline, we want to understand the supply chain. And in the talk David Hochman gave, he discussed the supply chain or the innovative supply chain. We're key to that. And again, he'll elaborate it much more today when he'll speak. But when we look at the innovative supply chain, the education industrial complex is a key driver of innovation. And credit for the development and the upscaling of the product is very important. Following that innovation supply chain, it is linked to a product supply chain where the firms or the companies or those scattered on the specific supply chain that uses the product, the raw material, the intermediate inputs, and the final output, or the consumer one that is consumed. You have the product supply chain that you later on put in place following the innovation, assuming it became successful. Enhancing the demand for that new product is again key, with social benefits that are beyond that of the private benefits, which is something that is common or something that we look at when we look at the environmental amenities. And he talked a lot about the supply chain in the context of the bioeconomy. And in that context, we also wanted to understand better uncertainty and credit constraints, how they constrain the establishment of new industries. And this is, again, something that, as policy, it's important to facilitate. Because, again, we want to create early adoption because that can bring change independent of the change that will supplement, that will complement or prevent changes in regimes, flip-flopping between policies, which is something that can create a lot of frustration by firms, and also firms basically avoiding or that additional risk. So we want to understand how bundling alternative payment schemes, such as leasing and credit, can support the innovation of new product and then the creation of the product supply chain. And finally, he pointed out that agricultural stakeholders face a complex and challenging financial risk environment, as do firms in general. In response to these risks, farmers can enjoy a range of risk management practices, including the utilization of risk. In the context of the environment, an important talk was given by Bruce McCarr, where he looked at agriculture and how agriculture fits into the climate change arena. The first, I'm going to focus on 2 points, and Bruce is going to elaborate much further on the other topics. I'm just serving his work. Again, this was presented in the ASSA, and you're welcome to view it there or ask Bruce for any other information. But one thing that he pointed out, agricultural R&D can serve as an adaptation mechanism. Drought tolerance is just one example out of many. But there's a problem here. R&D in production is declining. It's not only that it's moving from food to processing food. There's recent work by Alston and Pardee that actually showed that it's declining across the board. And this is kind of a concern, given that we do need investment in R&D to be able to cope with the changes that climate is bringing. We see we have the hottest year ever recorded this year, this month. Another component, a very important component in agriculture, it can also serve in mitigation, and specifically in terms of sequestration, biochar, enriching the soil, which have several environmental amenities that are beyond carbon. And this is an important point that will come, and he has the publication down there that show it, and this is graphs taken from Bruce McCall's work that shows that if you price that social cost of carbon, the use of sequestration in agriculture can substantially impact the environment. The final presentation, that another piece of this puzzle that we're trying to slowly bring it together, is given by Deepak Rajagopal, Dr. Deepak Rajagopal from UCLA. He compared two existing policies. One is the LCFS, the low carbon fuel standards implemented in California and now slowly being expanded to the whole West Coast. The other one is the RFS, which is a national policy. The RFS is a more rigid policy. There are about 5 buckets. You fall into one bucket and you get your incentives accordingly, but that's it. The LCFS is a much more refined policy. According to his analysis, it appears empirically that the LCFS is a superior way of targeting and achieving goals. It does have its problem. It's not perfect, but it does achieve its goal. It does, for example, it overlooks what happens at the farm. It only looks post-farm gate. Now that is important, especially if you take Bruce McCall's presentation. The farm agriculture can serve both, can be a mitigating source. Sequestration is important. All that component is basically put on the side. So LCFS looks post-farm. Once the biofuel feedstock leaves the farm gate, that's when the accounting starts, based on life cycle analysis. So there's the question, what happens before it, which is an important question that we're trying to understand. And there is the importance of waste, and there is some fragment policy on landscapes, but LCFS outperformed the RFS. And this is just, it's anecdotal evidence, not statistical, but we do see a clear decline. So policy, regulatory policy works, as we saw with the presentation of Dallas Bertrand. Regulatory policy works. Yes, market incentives are more efficient, but regulatory policy does trigger these changes. These papers are coming out, or specifically the one presenting the ASSA, are coming out in a choices, special choices issue. It should come online in August. We hope similarly that parts of this workshop will appear in print in one form or the other. This is something we'll discuss following this workshop, because we do believe that in addition to archiving it, which is something that we will do, it will be all recorded. Each presentation will sit by itself. Each presenter can add any paper or any supplemental information. There'll be a description that accompanies it. All of that will be on the CIFER website. It's likely going to take us more than a day or two, but within a week to two, I'm hoping that everything will come online. They're doing a great job. They're already chunking it up one presentation at a time for us. So that will be appearing online. And I do welcome everyone to visit our website. You can review many of these presentations, and again, send any query that you might have. And I do hope that we get this also in print in some form or another, based on what we all agree.